So I will start. So thank you very much. Thank you for everyone. I hope the interpreters can hear me well. I hope you can all hear me well. So good morning or evening to all of you. The Normandy Chair for Peace has the great honor of bringing together the transitional justice specialists, most of whom are indigenous representatives, in order to share with us their experiences with these processes, and in particular, to question the ability of transitional justice to affirm or reaffirm the rights of indigenous peoples. So these will be transitional justice specialists who will come back on the processes. There is no standard model of transitional justice. However, these mechanisms are based on 4 pillars: truth, justice, reparation, and the implementation of guarantees of non-repetition, which have been implemented following serious and massive human rights violations in different contexts, post-dictatorship, post-armed conflict, but also, for example, as we have seen in Canada, in response to the tragedies of residential schools or missing Aboriginal women. The Normandy Chair for Peace has been interested in this issue for several years now, with the Transitional Justice and Environmental Issues line, then under the direction of Luis Miguel Gutierrez, who organized with Laetitia Braconnier-Moreno 2 webinars on transitional justice and indigenous peoples. These videos of the meetings are available on the Chair's website. Last year, in November 2022, Émilie Gaillard, the scientific director of the Chair, and myself, as the person in charge of the indigenous peoples line of the Chair, we were invited to participate as observers in a UN International Expert Meeting on Transitional Justice and Indigenous Peoples, organized by the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. A feedback article, an article on our participation in this meeting is available on the Chair's website. The final report of this meeting was presented yesterday by Mr. Vital BAMBANZE, who is here now, who will be here in a few minutes, who will join us. He has presented this report during the session of the Permanent Forum in New York, and this report is published on the website of this forum. Laetitia Braconnier-Moreno and myself, we are now in New York, where we have been participating since Monday in the sessions of the Permanent Forum. We wanted to take advantage of this context to organize this meeting. So as you will understand, the situations that will be presented by the Francophone Institute for Justice and Democracy, as well as indigenous representatives, are very diverse, with distinct advances in transitional justice processes, but also very different degrees in terms of participation of indigenous peoples. So the idea of the webinar is thus to promote exchanges and the sharing of experiences in order to improve the participation of indigenous peoples in transitional justice processes, but also its contribution to indigenous peoples, namely to reaffirm their rights. The webinar will be organized as follows. We will hear our first 3 speakers, and then we will have a 15-minute discussion space before giving the floor back to the next 3 speakers from Guatemala and Colombia, and then we will have another discussion time. Laetitia Braconnier-Moreno and I will moderate the session. Laetitia Braconnier-Moreno is specialized in transitional justice processes, and she is a member of the Normandy Chair for Peace and of the line on transitional justice and indigenous peoples. So we invite you to stick to your time, so that we still have some discussion time after all the interventions. I also would like to thank the interpreters who will translate simultaneously your interventions in French, English, and Spanish. So you have a globe at the bottom of the screen, and you can choose between French, English, or Spanish. The session will be recorded and also broadcast on the Facebook Live of the Chair in French, English, or Spanish. So if you have some people who would, some friends of you who would like to assist, to attend this meeting. So I would like to thank also the Normandy Chair for Peace technical teams, because they have worked a lot recently. And I would like to thank Émilie Gaillard, and I'm also thinking about Dominique and all the other members of the team whom I haven't mentioned yet. Now I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Magali Bess. So Magali, welcome. Do you need to share a PowerPoint presentation? No, so that's fine. So Magali Bess, I will give you the floor very quickly. She's an expert. She specializes in public law. She's an expert in transitional justice. So this is a very interesting institute. So please have a look at their website. And I would like to give the floor to Magali. Magali, I cannot hear you. Probably your mic is off. I think the microphone is off. Please go ahead. Please switch on the mic. Yes, we can hear you. Right, I'm not sure what happened. So I would like to thank you. I wanted to thank the Normandy Chair for Peace for this invitation, which is an opportunity to present some activities from the Institute and to discuss with all of you and to learn from your different experiences. I will try not to speak too long. So the Francophone Institute for Justice and Democracy is the Louis Joinet Institute. So we're specialized in questions of transitional justice and the advent of democracy. We want to act according to 3 pillars, so thinking, acting in these 2 fields of transitional justice and democratization. So we conduct these activities with different priorities. So what is very interesting for us now, we also work on indigenous people. So this was not chosen randomly. This corresponds to the values of our organization and one of our main objectives, which is the participation and the inclusion of the most vulnerable and most marginalized groups. So in our activities, of course, we really try to do our utmost in order to remove any barriers, but we also want these different groups to participate to the transitional justice processes that relate to them, and also to seek justice for specific violations. So within this specific line, so we conduct activities regarding these 3 pillars: research, information. And so within our training, we have organized a summer school dedicated to this issue. We really want people who are interested in transitional justice, people who will be the future professionals in that field, and also the indigenous peoples who will be actually concerned by this. So of course there is a diversity, but you know, their needs, their worries and concerns. So we really try in the scope of our trainings to put this at the center and to also conduct training on transitional justice. So we participate in research activities because, of course, the aim is to discover new experiences, to understand, also to identify the mechanisms that enable their success or that led to failures, and to check that for, target populations, for example, indigenous peoples, were satisfied or not so satisfied about the process. So this research is essential in order to advance these processes and to improve the possibility for indigenous peoples to participate in these processes, or to initiate these processes. So we also conduct activities in the field within the scope, within the context of these transitional justice processes. So in the past few years, we have set up an office in the Central African Republic. So it's a generalist office that looks at all the questions of bringing democracy and transitional justice, with also support activities, also the support of victims and families of victims. And we have opened up a program dedicated to the indigenous peoples of the Central African Republic. There are several ones, and there are needs, there are lots of stigmas associated to these groups as well. And so far, we have really focused on the Baika question. So these are the pygmy populations, even if this term sometimes has a pejorative connotation. So, of course, there are several Baka communities, and with Leslie, who was one of the researchers in this project, we went to visit them with the intention of seeing what was the situation during the crisis. So during the event in the Central African Republic from the 2013 to 2015, and also to see how they would consider to participate in these transitional justice processes, what would prevent them from participating in these processes, and to try to enable them to participate in these processes. So these indigenous peoples are spread over several regions, and the issues are not the same. But in the region where we went, the people that we met and with whom we conducted interviews manifested their desire to participate, including by also going to the capital. I mean, traveling to the capital. But what we realized is that these groups were in a very disastrous, a very bad and appalling economic and social conditions. So actually, of course, people outside the capital don't live very well. But so the neighboring villages were already really suffering from a lot of poverty. But the Baka villages, the people who lived in these villages did not have access to health, did not have access to basic services. So what was interesting as well in this context was to see that the access to transitional justice is first of all conditioned on the fact of recovering dignity. So this is why the recommendations, the first recommendations that we issued were humanitarian recommendations, so to call upon the NGOs to go there and not to forget these people, because the armed Actually, this is quite a forgotten province, and the armed conflict is not very present in this province. So this was just the fact of enabling these people to access health, to access food, and so that they could then participate in that process of transitional justice. So this is information that we communicated, because we also work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, So they are perfectly aware of the difficulties of indigenous peoples in the Central African Republic. And now it is just starting, but there is this awareness thanks to the work that was conducted and thanks to the dialogue that we have with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There is this belief, this awareness, because indigenous peoples have really suffered all along this crisis. It doesn't mean that what they suffered is worse than others, but this needs to be recognized. There needs to be a guarantee of non-repetition. And these groups have a specific identity, a specific way of living. This needs to be recognized. So this is a first objective that is reached. So the fact of being aware of that, and this is some work that we will continue all along the work that we do with the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And of course, we will do this alongside national organizations that are working on a daily basis and that work in different languages, that have a very in-depth knowledge of the Baka culture. So with this organization, with some sort of partnership, we will really focus on this issue over longer term. So this requires work and support from the players in transitional justice, but we must not neglect the social and economic aspects so that people can really access these processes that we are offering them, proposing to them. And we initiated a project a few months ago, which relates to French Guiana. And this project actually aims at exploring the relevance of creating a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for a very specific question with regards to the Indian homes of Guyana. These were residential schools in French Guyana that had special contracts with the French state in which children and teenagers, Amerindian teenagers and children, as well as Bushiningwe children and teenagers so they were going to these schools. So it's not exactly the same problem as the problem we saw in Canada. We don't have like graveyards full of children, but nonetheless there was huge. There were huge impacts on children. So children were separated from their parents for months on end, with a clear intention of breaking family ties and breaking the construction of an identity, a culture, a know-how, a way of living. These were the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and these were people who were considered as inferior. So this story is well known, it is not hidden, but there was never a reparation process or a compensation process, and the access to education is very complex in Guyana for people who don't live in the big cities. So it is very difficult to get a way to get access to education in good conditions with indigenous teachings and without losing the link with the families and education. So one of the questions that will be very interesting to ask, if this Truth and Reconciliation Committee is found to be relevant, what sort of commission will it be? Will it be actually created by the French state, or will the French state officially participate in this commission, or will it be a truth commission which will be carried out and set up and initiated by non-state actors? So now we are considering whether there is actually enough interest from all the people involved, all the and then we will actually ask ourselves the questions about whether there are any other forms of non-state truth and reconciliation commissions that could be set up in order to see how we can move forward. So I hope I wasn't too long. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Magali. We will come back on some points. I have already taken some notes on what you said. So Mr. Vital BAMBANZE has some difficulties connecting, so I would like to give the floor to Mrs. AMINATA Diallo from Mali, who is a Touareg, and she's also leading the Ărramăt project. So I would like to give the floor to AMINATA.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Leslie. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me, and thank you for bringing the subject that is very important. So I'm not gonna use too much of the time. I'm gonna share my screen. I have a presentation that I would like to show about transitional justice and also child soldiers in Mali. So I'm gonna share my screen now. 1 second. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Oui, je te vois très bien. Voilà.
Okay.
C'est parfait. Merci, Aminata. Et Aminata est une chercheuse Touareg et Peul. Je ne sais pas s'il y a eu une confusion quand je me suis exprimée. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, so again, I'm very happy to be among you today. So the topic of today is about transitional justice and indigenous child soldiers phenomenon in Mali. It's not going. Yes, so as we know, transitional justice aims to resolve systemic or significant human rights violations and aims to address victims' reparation to prevent future repetition. And in the case of Mali, we've known conflict since the 1960s, and it has been a conflict that has been repetitional, so it would happen every 5 to 10 years since the 1960s. And there has been multiple peace agreements, but the most recent one was the one of 2012, following the 2012 rebellion that was signed in 2015 in Algeria. And that peace agreement lies upon institutional policies, defense and security, but the aspect of it which really emphasizes transitional justice is the truth, justice, reconciliation, and humanitarian issue, which gave ways to the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, which is the main mechanism of transitional justice in our peace agreement in Mali. And recently, that commission's mandate ended on 31st of December, with more than 23,600 victim statements, and that it started being recorded since 2015. And those victim statements dates from, those who've been victims of the crimes committed in the 1963's rebellion. So initially, they've led to the adoption by the Malian government of a reparation plan estimated at 65 billion francs CFA for the victims. and also the establishment of the law, which aims to really go on a 5-year plan to give reparation to the victims. Now, in the case of Mali, when it comes to the term indigenous peoples, the term indigenous people and the rights that comes with it is not recognized, because the ILO 169 convention has not been ratified in Mali. But Mali based itself on its constitution, which declares the defense of the national community, cultural, linguistic diversity, because it's a very diverse country, and that all citizens are equal before the law. But however, the most important factor is self-definition as indigenous people, which goes in the way that the people are affected and suffer injustice because of the way of life. As an example, the laws and the program based on a sedentary system versus people who practice nomadism. And within the case of indigenous people and the peace agreement, because in Mali, the conflict has mostly happened between the Touareg in the north and the community living in the south. And throughout the years, the conflict has evolved from the north to the center and had involved also other indigenous communities, such as the Peul. But it's becoming something that is taken a big impact on, let's say, most of Mali, and that includes indigenous and non-indigenous. Now, I really focused on the case of child soldiers because during my secondary research, I've always asked myself, why do we keep on having conflict? And I've seen that every 5 to 10 years, there would be conflict happening in Mali that would be repetitive. And it made me want to dig deeper into the side of the children that are affected by the conflict and what has been done to reintegrate them into the community, to try to give reparation, what transitional justice does. But it has seemed that that aspect and element of, which is so important because the children are usually the first victims of the conflict. And the conflict usually happens where the indigenous communities live, because those conflicts happen because indigenous, in our case, our indigenous communities live in the areas that are, that are not close to the capital city. Everything, social infrastructure and everything is in the capital, Bamako, but when you come out of Bamako, there's not really social infrastructure. So those indigenous communities live there and they're happy with it because it emphasizes the way they live, but the conflict happened there and the children are mostly exposed to this conflict. So in that sense, the indigenous youth is highly exposed to the conflict. And according to the ILO 169 and what it stands for about promoting the full realization of the social, economic, and cultural rights of the indigenous people, child soldier is really a violation of it, because child soldierings really impact the future in a long run of a community, which I will explain later on through the presentation. But it is a grave violation of human rights and an aspect that really need deep reparation, constant reparation. And also, as Ms. Magali Bessa said, a way for these things to not happen again, because that is one of the main issues, is that it's cyclical. And so I did a primary research in the northern side of my country, the red zones in Timbuktu, Kidal, Gao, Mopti, and Menaka in 2021, to see how the peace agreement has involved or not the case of child soldiers, and to see what was the current state of child soldiers in Mali and how they were reinserted or not into the community. and to identify opportunities and gaps in the system dealing with the issue of peace and reconciliation through the lens of stakeholders of the peace agreement, which included the indigenous community, the Touaregs, the government representative, the UN mission in Mali. So these were the former child soldiers, civil society, women. These were the stakeholders of the study. And what was found was that the current state of child soldiers in Mali is the process of what it was that they, through the DDR, which is the disarmament, demobilization, reinsertion of ex-combatant, which comes through the peace agreement, the children would be identified because some of them would want to reintegrate, even though, because the DDR is for 18 and plus, and there is no option for those who are below the age. So the youth would usually want to be part of the DDR, to be reintegrated in the national army. But then they would be spotted through the DDR process and then be given to the UNICEF, who would hand the children to the CTOs. And now the CTOs would have, would try to do psychological work and try to prevent the children from going back to the hostile environment. But the thing would be that the children will be given a project to do, and then only 150 francs CFA, and then after that, like, they would be like gone. So it would be, there'll be a follow-up from 6 months to 1 year, but not more. So after that, we don't know what would happen to the children, what they have become. Like, it was a solution that was for in the moment solution, but not consistent and not really dealing with the issue. So there was no model of success yet. There is no model of success. And it also shows the limitation of the peace and reconciliation agreement, the absence of realities of Malian context, such as the culture of weapon, which I think, since I don't have enough time to cover the whole presentation, I'm just going to focus now on the two other aspects that was found through the research. Was that the culture of weapons, it's something that has spread among the youth, the indigenous youth in the northern communities, because it represents the model of success, to be able to have power or a certain voice, which has not been given before. So due also to the lack of social infrastructure, opportunities, and also being exposed to the conflict, the young people aspire to what they see, which is drug trafficking, using weapons, joining, terrorist group or armed groups, because that is the way that they have to be able to, put food on the table or survive. So that aspect has existed since the 1990, but has not been considered when doing the peace agreement, which then brings me to the question, then how can the transition justice be then really successful if that element of the culture of weapon, its impact has not been taken into consideration? And also the fact that most people did not understand the peace agreement because it has a Western nature to it, if I should say. It's not, it does not go according to the people's tradition and what they know. So as a result, only 66.1% of the Malian population, they have no knowledge of the peace agreement. And that was a study that was established in 2021. However, the opportunity that transitional justice gives is in the DDR process, is that all all participants of the research have stated that the DDR process is a tool to eradicate confusion, so highlight children in a conflict and its usefulness in eliminating confusion about who is who, because there is armed group movements part of the peace agreement, then there is the terrorism, there is the multiple things happening there. So it gives visibility to the minors caught up in the conflict for them to be rehabilitated. And the DDR program was the most referred to when talking about the conflict and the child soldiers, even if the DDR is not in charge of the child soldiers, because you have to be 18 and plus. So, but the DDR process, as contrary to the peace agreement, is the thing that is known the most, represent a chance for everybody to have a common understanding and sit at the table to talk about the question of the child soldiers, which is even taboo, and what needs to be done to really ensure that the children are safe and protected and healed. What reparation, how do we even gauge the amount of reparation that is needed? Because it's so deep, it's so detrimental to the community. And you just have to go and look at the youth to know what will happen in the next 10 years to determine the future of the those indigenous communities. So really in terms of then transitional justice, indigenous communities, and the issue of child soldiers, the real question now is what first further research has to be done. Mon temps est passé, my time is finished.
Tu as encore une petite 2 minutes de conclusion, si tu le souhaites.
Okay, so what I wanted to say is that further research has to be done to establish, first of all, to know the indigenous knowledge, bring it back to practice, and know which indigenous practices and knowledge can be used in also transitional justice to facilitate the reintegration of these children back into the community. Because there has been cases in Mozambique in which they would be doing rituals, body wash, using traditional means for the children to be reinserted back into the community. It's part of my slides. I can share it with you guys after. Yeah, I hope that my presentation has shared insight with you guys, and I'm open to questions you may have and to also hear from your experience. Thank you.
Merci infiniment, Aminata. Effectivement, il y aura
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. For sure, we'll have questions. We also have many comments, and I mean, we also deal with the French Institute. So, anyways, we have now Vital BAMBANZE, who is connected with the Zoom for the audience. Anyways, if you have the opportunity to join us, then Vital, it's great. Perfect. So yes, hi. Hello, everyone. I will give you the floor. So, Vital BAMBANZE Mutwa from Burundi, member of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, Association Unissons, nous, pour la promotion des Batwa. So let's get united for promotion of Batwa. And this is the UNIPROBA Association. So great. So please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Yes. Good afternoon, good evening, Leslie. Good afternoon to all the participants. I'm delighted to be talking in this panel and to be talking about transitional justice and about the Batwa people, indigenous peoples of Burundi, after a very long period of suffering. So now there has been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is in charge of analyzing all the violations suffered by these people, and to see and to stop these violations from recurring. I am from Burundi. I'm part of the Batwa indigenous people, and I was the first who went to Burundi University at the age of 50. So you see, there are a lot of barriers, of course, when you want to access school and education. When you talk about transitional justice, there is not just war, there are other types of violations and which prevent these people from accessing basic services at different levels, be it at local, regional, or international levels. I'm a former senator amongst the representatives of the Batwa, the Senate of the Burundi, because in our constitution, the Batwa people can participate in the National Assembly. So this is a good thing in Burundi compared to other African countries or other neighboring countries. So compared to Rwanda, the DRC, and Tanzania, I think in these countries, such progress has not been made already. So the minister in charge of human rights actually comes from the Batwa community. So we can really thank the Republic of Burundi. I've tried to make, which has really tried to make some progress in the advancement of Batwa's community's human rights. I'm a member of the Permanent Forum of the United Nations on the indigenous questions, but I'm also a member of indigenous organizations at a regional level and of another committee in Africa, which is an umbrella organization for Africa. But there are also representatives of indigenous peoples in the Central African region. So all of this made me understood that us indigenous peoples, we are not marginalized as citizens. We need to have all of the rights and freedoms that are endowed to all the citizens in a very universal manner. So when we talk about justice, transitional justice, so what kind of justice do we need? So justice is, first of all, about recognition, so recognizing what happened in the past. And we can say we've been marginalized, we've been discriminated against, we've been excluded from all of the processes, and we were not on an equal footing. We did not avail of all our rights on an equal footing. So, for example, I look at decolonization. So in Africa, when you talk about indigenous peoples, okay, we're told that, okay, colonization meant that all African people were called an indigenous people. So at an international institutional level, we could not talk about indigenous people in certain fora. But after colonization, I would like to talk more on an overall in an overall manner. So after colonization, did indigenous people avail of their dignity and self-determination, just like other people, just like other independent people? I would say it has been really slow. So what is the definition of the criteria, the recognition of criteria of indigenous people in Africa? So as a Batwa people, what was recognized by the Commission on indigenous peoples in Africa. So what do we have? When we look at the question of transitional justice and truth and reconciliation, the error that is often made is that you often talk about people who suffered from wars or who conducted wars. So there are dictatorship periods. You need to have armed conflict. You need to have military occupation. But the people who were victims of violations, of human rights violations, also need to participate in the peace processes. So when we talk about truth and reconciliation in Burundi, we refer to war periods. There was the period of 1965, where there was a change of process. And even before, in 1961, the notions of crimes, assassinations, political assassinations had started. So in 1972, this was the worst period. This worsened. There were group killings of Hutu elites, the elites that were in power, economists, and some people who had democratic thoughts, ways of thinking. It was the case. Also, there were, of course, wars between the Hutus and Tutsis, and a lot of refugees. So a lot of people left the country. There was pillaging of goods from people who were accused. In 1993, this was the worst situation, where the elected president was killed. This led to a revolt. And this is where you had a lot of military confrontations with the army. And then in 2005, you had a peace accord for a total reconciliation. And in these peace agreements, this is within that context of this peace accord that the truth and reconciliation concept arose, in order to find ways of reconciling the entire people, and in order to ban all acts of genocide in the future, in order to guarantee a better future for the whole nation. So when we analyze this, we see that all of these commissions, when we set them up, we think only about these actions of dictatorships and assassinations, but us, the Batwa people, who were always a Pacific people, and we suffered from this marginalization process, we are not considered, we are not taken into account. because I mean, only the war periods were taken into account. So we would like to be able to participate, and we would like this commission to analyze the consequences of the wars on the peaceful populations that we are. Because when there is a war on a territory, you know, the Batwa were victims in one way or another.
Non seulement n'étaient pas concernés, ils ne connaissaient pas les essais,
they didn't know why there were these wars, but there was also a recruitment of the Batwa children who were then participating in armed conflicts on both sides, on rebel side and on the other side. So these were also victims within the Batwa community. So we cannot analyze questions of war without taking into account victims who did not even know about this war, who were not committed, who did not have any interest in this war. So these are economic consequences for the economy of the Batwa people. For example, when the war started, the Europeans, the other financial institutions came to help the displaced persons, the refugees, and came to provide some sustainable equipment. And among the Batwa people, some people benefited from some free goods, but the economy of the Batwa people was affected. It meant that some Batwa children could not eat, you could not get cured, you could not get access to health. So this is something which needs to be analyzed in one way or another. When we're looking at compensation, reparation, we cannot just look at war victims. We need to look at the populations which suffered from consequences. And I think with regards to education, Batwa children could not attend school in a satisfactory way and were not able to go to school just like other children, because there were accusations and prejudices about Batwa children. A lot of people said that the Batwa children would smell would not smell very nice. So all of these would have a very strong smell. So this is all consequences. So if we could maybe base ourselves on the needs, the peaceful ways, in order to find the key for national reconciliation. This means that we need to revise, to review all the national history, all the history of Burundi, and look at the consequences for the economy of Batwa people. Why not creating integrative commissions that would take into account all of the layers of the populations in order to provide reparation for everyone, and then really seek the non-repetition. So this, maybe I was a little bit long. Sorry about this. Can you hear me? Yes, yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, I would like to thank all the panelists, and thank you very much for giving me the floor. Yes, there will be some time for questions all along this session and to share. So just a few comments before opening up this session. We see that a few things are highlighted. So the importance of the actions of this Institute for Justice and Democracy and their very diverse program with transitional justice. We see, we had some discussions, we see how we're responding to one another, and we see how another actor can intervene in this process of transitional justice. There are some gaps to fill. So in your intervention, Magali Bess, with regards to the Central African Republic, we saw also the actions and institutional weaknesses, because there are ongoing conflicts and we cannot expect everything from the non-state actors, and we cannot just act in an emergency and one part of the population is just invisible, because the indigenous populations is assimilated to the rest of the population, but they are more vulnerable and they have additional difficulties in terms of access to basic services. So it's important to look at this and to conduct this research work and to indicate what sort of actors and players could intervene in these ongoing transitional justice processes. So the multiplication of these players and the importance of research. And Mrs. Aminata Diallo is an example of this unprecedented research. So she actually goes to some sites where safety conditions are are not at all provided, and she really highlights these populations that are not mentioned in these systems of transitional justice. So how can we install these processes there? And then we talk about the importance of the DDR program and the collaboration, the strengthened collaboration in order to reinforce this research action in the field. And Mr. Vital BAMBANZE is talking and translating the question about the issue of the question of indigenous peoples in Africa and the marginalized peoples in Africa who have been victims as well as involved in conflicts. Sometimes they have been involved because they needed to defend themselves. They're not necessarily taking part actively in the conflict, but they need to defend themselves. So, as Mrs. Diallo said, and then the absence of recognition, so the absence of access to territory, the absence of access to health. So there was also a very interesting question online, which was raised in English. The question was, and I think we will respond to it for the next presentations on Colombia and Guatemala. Are there what about their involvements, and was it useful? How and why? So there was this question: have spiritual and religious leaders from or serving in marginalized communities been actively involved in the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions? Has their involvement been helpful or not, and how and why? And there is another question. If you had any elements of response with regards to the involvement of elements of traditional communities, so what would it bring? So we know that today the Batwa are not involved in the transitional justice process in Burundi. What would it bring?
So first of all, I think that Burundi has this, was based on the question of people, so-called, elite people, which were chosen amongst the community to be honest, to be able to talk, to express themselves. And this is the first point. And then also, together with the government, we are developing this aspect about tradition, about justice, transitional justice, and so on. So we need to recognize those people. And this is extremely important as for the trust given by the community, and they will be able to help on transitional justice and also to give the basic knowledge. So for us in Burundi, this is really key. And then as for the other question, so traditional representatives have had an evolution because each representative should collaborate with the magistrates and the procurers, but also they need to work on the resolution. Just because we were, more working on not only on punishment, but to correct the person, to change the person in order to have this, involvement in society and see the people change. And one example which is really important is to see exactly what happens on the society. And for me, it is positive as far as the, global resolution of conflict ideas are concerned. And also it gives you a future which is connected to the Pacific resolutions, which are traditionally used. So yeah, thank you. So, and also about self-determination. Oh, we'll come back to that later. Okay, great. Perfect. Thank you. So, and also it is, a very, very long question. So, yeah. Great. And thank you, Vito, once again, because all these elements will, echo or Colombia situation and also all the other systems which are taken into consideration. Magali, best you raised your hand. Yes, I wanted to add one more word. Of course, Vito could correct myself, but there is a representative amongst commissioners of the commission in Burundi, probably that, may also have an influence about the representation, who has been chosen to represent the community, has the person enough knowledge, education, is that person like a real militant for these indigenous people, and then what's its role? I mean, is that a person amongst a lot of other commissioners not having a real impact? So this is, the kind of questions that we must keep in mind about representation and who we choose. The same for like women's participation in other groups. So yes, and also second point, that might be maybe the difference that we have amongst general commissions which exist in Burundi or elsewhere in Central Africa, African Republic, and so on. But anyways, we have a mechanism which is really interesting about the specific ad hoc commissions on indigenous people. So this is exactly what we said before about Burundi, about those communities not being part of these, war, war actors, not having a very, very high level of action. But sometimes it could, be the consequence of a transitional justice, just because we do not have, a process of discrimination which is really clear. here. So it is like a logical process, unfortunately, but then we must also try to compensate with transitional justice to be able to consolidate peace and to keep peace. So these tools are dedicated to indigenous people, and that would guarantee probably not to have, any more those situations. Anyways, if we are not satisfied with what has been done in the past, maybe using those specific mechanisms, we could, trying to solve these issues. Thank you for your remarks. So, in fact, we'll see if that is possible. Now, I would like to give the floor to AMINATA. According to you, what would be the correct actions to support the DDR project, but also to implement new projects for children who are less than 18? Right, thank you for your questions, Leslie. First of all, I would like to answer the question regarding the religious leaders which have been included in the process. So personally, I'm not aware of that. I mean, inside the process, but I know that in Mali, we have organized weeks of reconciliation where the religious leaders came and they, talked about peace and with this government, with this regime, they came back to traditional practices because each community has a diversity. So in its practices, so everyone would have its own code between communities. You have like kind of agreements between us. So it has now become a decree to be part of the whole community. So let's see now what will happen in the future. But coming back to your question, how to support this kind of research, I think it's rather more important to talk about child soldiers and the impact about that taboo, because it has a great importance in those communities, because spiritual religious communities have a great impact on the communities, indeed, in the in all those field of transitional justice, but also as for the DDR and governmental institutions, you need to have funds, specific funds, which are available for these research, these kind of research, and also try to collaborate between the institutions, between the religious, traditional people, indigenous people, but also to work on decolonization, because this is important to create partnerships around those topics. So anyways, thank you, and I hope I've answered your question. Yeah, right, thank you, absolutely. This is so much important to diffuse these, messages. So now I would like to give the floor to the next speaker. So, I mean, no, before, Laetitia Braconnier will introduce the next session with Guatemala and Colombia experts. So please excuse us because we have some delays. So thanks to all of you. Thank you, Magali, Vital, and Aminata.
Muchas gracias, Leslie. Muchas gracias.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. So I would like to thank all the participants. I would like now to give I will switch to Spanish. I would like to thank interpreters which allow us to be able to discuss and exchange. So we're able to, have this opportunity. And thank you to the share of Normandy, which allows us to have these debates about indigenous people. So now we would like to give the floor to experts who are not able to come to New York, and this discussion will be recorded and diffused on our site so that you can use it later on for the diffusion of those mechanisms for, traditional justice, as we've said. So for the second part of this workshop, this conference, we have Guatemala and Colombia now. So I would like to highlight one aspect. We have one person of the indigenous people of Sierra Nevada, and well, recently we've seen that we have the opportunity to connect between all the indigenous people. And I have a question for you. So which are those mechanisms in order to solve these issues? And then what about the solution on territory? So how can we find those mechanisms be able to repair, to solve these violations in terms of loss of territory? So we first have AMILCAR, lawyer of the Maya people, member of the Congress of the Republic of Guatemala and of the Central-American Parliament, where he shares with the Commission of Indigenous and Afro-descendant people. So you have 15 minutes. So I know you have so many
Thank you to all of you. I'm not in a very good situation. I'm in the Uchis indigenous territory, so I'm here to defend and support these people in order to defend their territories. These are not ideal conditions, but it is a good place. I would like to talk to you about the process and the situation in Guatemala since the signature of the peace accord, the peace agreement. We had some very interesting elements with this, the signature of these peace agreements. We have 23 indigenous peoples of Maya origin, of Maya descent in Guatemala. We have another people, Chorchui. It's a ramification of the Chorchui people. So we have different ethnies, and historically a Creole group from a Spanish ascent governed the nation. And in the past 200 years, they have controlled all of the state bodies. And this was a colonization process in Latin America. We had an armed conflict for 36 years, 250,000 victims. And a lot of these victims were disappeared and did not avail of any compensation or reparation. We had a terror policy from the state whereby some actors directed a war on indigenous peoples, and behind a proposal there was a guerrilla against indigenous peoples, but the historical reality and circumstances demonstrated that it was not an ideological conflict. It was a process of appropriation of the territories of indigenous territories, because there were 6 100 massacres of indigenous peoples, and as well as persecution and massive destructions within this territory. There are still conflicts in these territories with regards to mining and oil reserves, oil exploitation. So war structure generated huge possibilities and opportunities for some international groups and some industries. For example, the food industry. This is what we noticed. So the Truth and Reconciliation Committee was created, and it generated some important paradigms. It was able to observe the inequalities generated by the wars. There was a Truth and Reconciliation Committee conducted by the United Nations that also released and published reports which confirmed these inequalities. On the 29th of December 1996, the last peace agreement, which was a final agreement, was signed. This was preceded by the global agreement on human rights and the agreement for indigenous peoples. And even though the participation of indigenous peoples was extremely limited, but at the same time, this was a source of hope for indigenous peoples, because at least they were considered as such, as indigenous peoples by the Republic. So this was a real success in this context, the context of the signing of the peace agreement. So this was a very important process for the recognition of peoples as law subjects, and also in the context of the 169th Convention of the ILO. So this generated a huge debate within the Guatemalan population around the questions of indigenous rights. This also generated a general rejection from part of the population, a racist white population, the white elites. So the source of the conflict today and the challenges we have today against these elites. So I would like to actually explain two consequences of these peace agreements. So the first of all, the fact of establishing new conditions for indigenous people. So there is a mandate in order to fight against racism and discrimination against indigenous people. I was a lawyer at the time of the creation of this commission. So there were 85 trials in order to defend the people. We were co-opted by several sectors in the country. The Secretariat for Agricultural Affairs was created because after the war in Guatemala, there was already there was always a lot of conflicts with regards to food and agriculture. We have experienced 1,400 conflicts with regards to food. and the agri-food business, because this sector is controlled by main industrial players. Because the agri-food process in Guatemala created some bans for indigenous peoples. I mean, it banned the possession or the creation of farms. There was also the Fund for Indigenous Development. It's a fund for land in order to guarantee the possibility of purchasing farmland for indigenous people, purchasing land. It was for purchasing or selling land, but it did not work. It was a failure. And the secretariat was always a failure. And the last government actually removed it this year. So we had 1,400 land-related conflicts with regards to farmland, and in spite of that, the government decided to remove the secretariat that aimed at removing these, at fighting these conflicts. So, but we're trying to create the possibility of repairing and resolving these problems for indigenous people. So since the 1990s, we experienced problems with the most fertile regions where there were the most natural resources in terms of minerals, etc. So the idea was to resolve indigenous issues, but as I said, after the signature of the peace agreement, the government decided to remove, to get rid of the Secretariat for Agricultural Issues. So now we are experiencing a similar situation to the situation we experienced during the war. So not the armed conflict, but we are now experiencing a situation whereby we see a lack of rights, and indigenous peoples have tried to defend their territories and the right of consultation and their ability to produce their own food and the ability to get supplies and to become the owners of their land. Some leaders of our peoples were arrested. We had the possibility to speak to the government, but the situation at the end of this process of discussion with the government was not very good. So, for example, a few years ago, a former dictator, was punished by the International Court, was found guilty and sanctioned by the International Court. But even though the judgment was passed, he still hasn't gone to prison. He has been convicted, but he hasn't gone to prison. And for the other crimes against humanity, Arhuaco, with the mayor of Cepuizarco. Why am I talking to you about this? Because this created a very dangerous precedent in the country, because so even if the actors, the perpetrators of these crimes and other conflicts and other actions against our people are still free, they have not been convicted. all this. And there is still a debate that goes on because there are in industries that are very radicalized, the military and industrial players are conducting a very strong campaign against these debates that we're trying to foster. So Guatemala is now experiencing an institutional and a state crisis. There was the expulsion of the Commission Against Impunity, former government 4 years ago. The commissioner, Yvan Belatre, was sent back. And Sweden as well. So its ambassador expelled from the country because the ambassador was supporting our requests, our petition. So the Mambelaske commissioner and this other ambassador were expelled from the country because they were supporting our petition. So this is, and supporting our request. So this is a situation with justice in this country. So we are now close to a point of non-return. There are even judges and even public prosecutors that were expelled, that were victims of retaliation because justice isn't done and justice isn't working, and indigenous people and civil society and the people among us who are trying to establish real democracy, we are in danger. And the Supreme Court and the highest bodies are also in danger, and the general prosecutor is still serving the criminal groups. Thank you very much. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy AMILCAR. Thank you for explaining this story about the conquest of people and the situation about democracy in this country. Thank you for talking about Maya people and this historical petition and request. Now I would like to give the floor to BELKIS IZQUIERDO from the Arhuaco ethnic, who was the first magistrate in the Chamber for the Recognition of Truth and the Vice President for the Special Jurisdiction for Peace from Bogota in Colombia. She's an indigenous woman from the Arhuaco people. Thank you very much.
Magistrada, su micrófono está apagado.
I'm sorry, we cannot hear you. Yes, thank you very much. I would like to greet Leticia, Leslie, thank you for inviting me. I totally agree with what the other speakers have just said. I also share with you the reality that you have expressed. I wanted to talk to you about the situation of Colombia and the final peace agreement. The point number 5 of this agreement for the victims and the integral system that was created, the global system that was created. I want to talk to you about how justice works in this country. We have the government, the FARC, that have recognized that the indigenous peoples contribute to the construction of a sustainable peace and contributed to social and economic progress in this country, even though they were victims of slavery, expulsions, colonialism, and the loss of their territories and resources, even though they were victims of the internal armed conflict, and they were not able to exercise their human and social rights. So the social jurisdiction for peace decided to create a safeguard for indigenous peoples, the complete system for justice and reparation, and for unity, and also for justice for the people who have disappeared. So a special jurisdiction for peace decided to include the ethnic and racial approach in all of the laws and in all of the standards, and even for the internal status of the states. They need to be consulted. This is the first time that a court of justice has recognized these rights. So this was a success because for the first time, several groups, several collectives in Colombia gathered together in order to ask for this recognition. We also recognize the need to respect their petition, their requests, and the inclusion of different articulation mechanisms with the also the justice mechanism for indigenous peoples. This was understood as a justice mechanism for a prospective justice based on dialogue. These mechanisms need to become a reality. And we also have included the participation of indigenous peoples, like special speakers, in all of the process, so not only as victims. So we need to go further than just the consideration of victims, exclusion, and poverty. We need to support relationships that are based on an equal footing, and this special jurisdiction for peace is one of the first courts that has included indigenous peoples, with 8 people: Manuela Cha, Kamana, magistrate, and myself, magistrate from the Arhuaco people from the Cordillera of Santa Marta. So 4 magistrates who intervene in the processes, in the health processes, in economic and social processes, etc. The special jurisdiction for peace is made up of 38 magistrates, among whom 4 magistrates are indigenous, are from indigenous peoples. So this is important. This appreciation is very important. In Colombia, there are 50 indigenous peoples, Senanter, etc. So we cannot make some generalization because there are lots of indigenous peoples. So we need to work and to understand the makeup of all the indigenous people. So it's important to mention this very diverse reality and the coordination of the link between the mechanism, the justice mechanism, and each people in order to guarantee this participation of indigenous people, because these indigenous people have suffered a lot. They have suffered the most from the consequences of these conflicts. But of course, we need to conduct some research with the authorities. And how can we do that? Indigenous communities and Black communities need to defend their territories. This is very important. They should not go in front of the courts and magistrates as victims. They need to stand on an equal footing. They need to defend their rights, but they need to be on an equal footing, because they understand there is a lack of harmony and there is a lot of disagreements created by conflicts. And we need to create a very different perspective. Otherwise, we will always have the same conclusions. We need to put our needs at the center. So here I am talking about the territory of nature as a living being that guarantees the identity, the plurality, and resources for the people. So we need to integrate this nature as a victim of the conflict. We need to put at the center the needs, the concerns, and the worries of these people. And of course, how they experience these conflicts and how they would like to go about with the reparation of this damage. Now I would like to talk about some worries, some concerns that we have. I would like to invite also Leslie and Leticia and others to overcome this discrimination, because when we talk about transitional justice, when we talk about this assessment of the indigenous system, what are the mechanisms conducted by the judge who works for transitional justice in the face of this new vision? Here we're talking about legal plurality. We need to establish a dialogue with the justice system, the legal system, because sometimes there is a gap between theory and practice, and we really need to fill this gap. And how can we repair the damage inflicted to nature? Because indigenous people will understand life in a totally different way. And you know that. You know how we protect the systems, the life support systems. These are very diverse systems that do not put the human being at the center. There are always these interconnections, and we need to put an end to this. We need to repair the territory. We should not repair only the human beings, the living beings, but also the territory, the damage created to nature, to the sacred sites, the goods of the people. So we have receiving all of this knowledge. It is now necessary to go through an opening and to go back to the origins. And this is why what transitional justice wants to take into consideration. There is also the question of the voice of the indigenous community, which needs to be taken into account as an authority for all of these reasons, all of these agreements. So we need to include these rights within the scope of legal decisions, legal judgments, and with regards to the different actions and sanctions with regards to transitional justice in Colombia, we need to work in a coordinated way so that these restoration work, these projects or these sanctions can satisfy the rights of people, of ethnic people, of indigenous people. Otherwise, we could build from top to bottom, have the top-down approach, but we could also go back and involve the legal process with the basis of society to review the procedures in order to be players, not just political players, but we need to have an indigenous judge who has the potential to bring a very good contribution in this scheme. This is how we could bring a very good contribution in the reconstitution of this social network and social structure. And we have these spaces, and there is also a fear that these spaces would be abandoned in the discussions without going into the heart of the issue, without being able to include and integrate the voice of indigenous peoples in this, in the reparation process. And how can we reconcile the reality in these different territories without this voice? This is the work that we have done. It was also an internal work within our jurisdiction. When we see the territory as a victim, we look at microcrime and we see all the damage generated to life and to peoples in general, how to show the legal consequences in the face of all this damage and our heritage and cultural heritage. I would now like to share with you something which is really important in relation to the framework for the construction of peace. In the regulation, there is an article with regards to Black and Afro-Colombian communities. All the sections of the court need to take into consideration the principles and the basis of the traditional justice systems that aim at reconciliation, reparation for the victims, and in order to reinforce the social structure and the reorganization of our territory. In order to conclude, we have made some progress, but it is necessary that one of these source systems of this transitional justice would be the system 1 and 2, reinforce the participation of indigenous authorities within this process, to recognize the spiritual authorities, to make them the voice of the territory, and that all of the damage suffered by the territory, nature, the rivers, should have legal consequences. Thank you very much, Mrs. Magistrate. We know that you are very, very busy with all that you have been presenting, and we know that this work and these strategies of regulations, that we know that you're bringing a very important space, and the transitional justice process in Colombia is requiring a lot of efforts, and we know how much efforts you're bringing to this work. And it's very good that you bring the attention to other types of justice, and it is necessary in order to really have a concrete result of this reparation and to compensate all of the victims, which is why we have already decided to invite a representative from the territory who is Hormiga, from a region in Colombia for armed conflicts, and this was restructured. And when we talk about the transitional, top-down approach of transitional justice, I thought it was important to have his perspective. Thank you very much. You have the floor.
So your mic is on mute now. Hello, everyone. I would like to share the good vibes, good energies, despite all the difficulties that we have. We are extremely participative to all your efforts, and we acknowledge all your efforts. And we live day by day the oppression, these, search in order to really find a good balance in favor of the earth. We do have to follow the natural laws. Until we do not follow them, we won't go in the right direction. And this is our motto: to survive. I am Mariela Miga, and I am liberator of Mother Earth and our rights, indigenous communities of North Cauca, Colombia, together with children, with women in the several territories where we have this energy. And that was our, daily purpose. We want to find new strategies in order to implement that vision, and also to obtain parcels of earth, of soil, to live decently. So this is why we have been struggling, and we are little by little making progresses, but we wanted to stay in our territories, and we wanted to, as said, struggle for diversity. So we, also talk on behalf of other peoples. We want to free the earth, as said, liberator of Mother Earth. So in this, vision, we want to be clear, but if we now want to describe the administration, the institutions that we have, we are living a disaster in daily. I mean, as liberators of the earth, we could describe enemies everywhere, adversities everywhere, and this is what we do. We actually, dedicate so much time, and we are, we are a lot of peoples, for Migas and others, who are struggling for that freedom. So today, instead of introducing so many ideas, what about you asking me questions? Because we have so many information on the websites, but we do not see the reality on the internet. So if you want to ask me questions, I will answer them with pleasure. So, Leticia, what about what is your vision on the territories? What is your job, your activity daily as, earth keepers and liberators of the earth? So the episodes that we faced, have so many risks. What I can tell you now is that in those territories, in our territories, we have gods, and freedom is like giving back earth, which means that the territory that belonged to us is now back to us. So this is much of a cultural debate in order to have these liberators working properly and give us the ability to come back to our territories, and also to find our lives where they should have been. And this is a warrant of our freedom, because our process of life is, connected to human rights, but it's of course also not, implemented by the governments, not respected by them. So these are obsolete politics. So we need to see, of course, the current government who has good willingness to go in our direction. So this is why we believe we will be able to continue for in the future to work on that, to hope that finally we will be able to be indigenous. It means that we are on our earth and we live with dignity on our earth. Thanks. We know that, spaces, you're talking about spaces and the rights of those space of earth, and we need to have more connections with nature, with the local variety species. But what about the principles that you follow in your activities? So these principles could be helpful also for other people to adopt them and to follow them. Yes, of course. First principle, if I may, is for us let's say, most important one. It's the order or the opportunity to belong to one territory. It is the choice of the seeds. It is to select seeds. So whenever you have a crop, you follow those seeds and you see the crops developing so that you can develop yourself on that territory and develop your personality, develop your human being. So the first principle is integrality. So it is, a unique principle. Maybe it could be in the opposition of peaceful, but it is actually being a fighter, struggling for the dignity of our territories to be able to live peacefully. You see what I mean? So this is exactly the first concept, because we find our spirituality, our strength on that principle, and basing our energy on that. So of course, according to the colonial definition given to that word, is still present. The Catholic and Judeo-Christian tradition is so much important, and this is representing so many obstacles to our culture. But anyways, we try to go forward. Thank you. I would also say to our audience that you can send written questions, just in case we do not have enough time to answer those questions. Anyways, we'll of course consider all the questions and send you written answers from all the speakers that we had today. So obviously, I have many questions here for AMILCAR, BELKIS, and Ariel, because I don't know if members of the Congress, AMILCAR Pop is still with us, but he, repeated several times that indigenous justice should have proper solutions to issues which are not always in harmony, because they are created by external, actors, and sometimes they are connected to governments. So it could be like armed groups or other, let's say, entities. So why would you, wait for solutions from this kind of transitional justice? And we've been already, talking about that, and we know that peoples are not responsible of that lack of harmony, obviously. This is why we find a contradiction, because would it be possible to have indigenous peoples be able to answer those questions? And is that connected to ordinary justice? So I think we need to rethink the world according to, a lot of centuries ago. This is not possible. So we need to consider these fights, those struggles, and namely the Cauca, North Cauca peoples. This is a great example to follow, indeed. Great, thank you. So it seems we have an issue with the connection, with your connection, Mr. Ormilla. Now, what about the member of the Congress, AMILCAR Pop, are you able to join? Yes. Okay, I think, as I did participate to Maya Association of Lawyers, but as a lawyer, and in that case, we've been finding instances. So we had like a lot of situations connected to the Black River killings. And at the beginning of my career as a lawyer, I remember that within this association, Maya Association, we were wondering about the justice and how far the Maya justice could solve processes which are, in progress, and that in favor of the earth. So, and my position was no, meaning that the indigenous authorities could represent the victims of the aggression, genocides, policies. So, of course, we were victims. So, if having all the indigenous peoples participating, of course, that would be extremely important, because we were dealing with the public policies as actions. But this is only one perspective, because I think we have another process here, and we started that around 25 years ago. And that process is actually in the core of that. Well, actually, we apologize because we have issues with the connection of AMILCAR Pop. Now we have Mrs. BELKIS Izquierdo. So we have issues with the connection. Sorry. It seems we have our speakers overlapping.
La escuchamos, magistrada.
So you have the floor.
Sí, para mencionarte que esta es una pregunta muy compleja.
It's a very difficult question.
Y así lo ha dado alguna magistratura, y es, claro, la guerra es ajena a los pueblos indígenas.
I think the wars do not belong to indigenous peoples, obviously, but the wars are connected to the companies which came on our territories, and that created these issues. So these wars are not connected to us, but we were the first people, to be facing those walls. In Colombia, jurisdiction, which is very special, indigenous one, it is a constitutional law. It is recognizing, acknowledging all the systems. We have standards and authorities. So it is actually a war which is, as said, external from our territories. And as justice, we are victims because we have nothing to say, and we are only victims. So it is important to see what can be done between the processes as indigenous participants, but also as the spiritual participation as for the territories, the culture of those places, and so on. And also, whenever we have those right and clear elements to understand why we are in the center of all these issues. So this is extremely important to understand how we can, how we are able to face those issues. So, and we need to face also the eventual juridical consequences. And this is the point, because we are not considered, or those territories are not considered as indigenous living people, and the identity that we have is not taken into consideration. So even if we, could interpret those facts, it is still extremely important to refuse that and to say, no, we cannot accept this kind of system, this kind of justice as victims. So I think that indigenous crimes, are considered as less important. So we cannot, of course, apply this kind of justice in these situations, which are extremely important. So we need to have the systems of justice able to create a new dialogue, a different dialogue. So we have issues corresponding to the lack of law, to the lack of support, to the lack of budget, of finances for our people. But now we must also be considered as authority with its, justice. So we need really to focus on this point. We need to find a better balance, and also to get in this framework of transitional justice for macro, crimes, issues, and so on. So we have so many cases in the Cauca region, North Cauca, and so on. So we are not only victims, we are also, as said, members, authorities, and we must be considered as such in this new dialogue, understanding why these deep damages are so much inside our existence. So thank you so much. Okay, we have another question here as for the organization of justice. What about the authorities be able to have their own jurisdiction, and also what about the articulation of the organization between indigenous justice and GEP? This is a very, very specific and complex question. Probably I will send you, this question in the chat so that we can have a written answer. So we need now to stop interpretation because the interpreters were booked till 7 p.m. So anyways, these questions are key. So this is why we need to think of all these associations and consider them as, main actors. So we have now some issues with our speakers. I would like to give now the floor to each of our speakers to make their own conclusions. So please, we have like 2 minutes maximum for each speaker. So I will start with AMILCAR Pop. Great, thank you. And all my apologies, the connection failed. But anyways, we have 3 dimensions in justice. First, we have the justice in the transitional justice considered for after war, which is of course connected to culture, to traditions, to the relationships with the territory and with the earth. So it's key that judges understand these cultural elements which will be connected to human beings. Second, dialogue between justice with justice is also extremely important, and we've been working on that on the last 20 years. This is so-called the plurality, the respect between systems, and this is exactly what we were dealing with a second ago. So giving more dynamic, more values to those procedures. And third, of course, the transition. We have a very clear transition for after war to get towards democracy, the state of right, and so on. We need to make very clear reform about, all the bodies and entities and all the procedures in that framework of new jurisdiction. And we have, of course, mechanisms of new systems, but also experts and the different interventions of experts. Great, thank you so much, Amilcar, because you stayed in that 2 minutes time. So great, so now we give the floor to Ariel Árramăt. I don't know if you will be able to connect again, but now maybe BELKIS Izquierdo, would you like to conclude? It is key that legal systems be reinforced in that transitional justice vision. It is part of the process. And then also we need to understand that the territory, nature, and sacred sites are
es fundamental para poder hacer la paz territorial. Es necesario contar con
and this is the way to peace. We need to have all these elements in order to have a wider knowledge. And then we need to follow all these laws, because transitional justice must reinforce these aspects of rights as indigenous people, and all these lessons learned around dialogue, around horizontal opportunities to create discussions must be applied amongst all these systems. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to all our speakers for participating to our session. I would like to thank AMILCAR Pop as well, and Ariel Árramăt, who was not able to connect again. So I think really it was so much interesting. I would like now to give back the floor to Leslie. I would like to thank all of you, thank all the participants from Guatemala, Colombia, and all over the world. So thank you so much. Now we'll go back to the conclusions and of course, continue our debate. So this is really, really important to work on transitional justice and the participation of peoples in that framework. So I hope that during our next forum, we'll have more and more space officially to deal with those topics. So we, of course, keep in touch to continue our debate and exchanges. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you for, your participation. Thank you to all our eminent speakers. And so, of course, we had since the beginning AMINATA, DIALLO, Vital, BAMBANZE, Magali, Bess, and then AMILCAR Pop, of course, BELKIS, IZQUIERDO, and Ariel Hormiga. So I think it was so much important to be able to exchange these ideas, to keep in touch, but also to create probably a new ideas about transitional justice, because it is really extremely enriching to be able to see all these impacts. I would like also to congratulate the work on decolonization, which is being done, and also Mrs. BELKIS Izquierdo has been, talking about the connection as a magistrate also with the peace between earth, between peoples, between men and women. And we have so many challenges, so we need to, tackle those topics and be able, of course, to connect all together with that. So thank you once more. We have a question about the best practices from the special jurisdiction around about peace in colonial context. We keep that question, if you agree, and we'll send those questions to, of course, to BELKIS Izquierdo Torres, and will, of course, publish the answers on our site. We have our event available in 3 languages. It has been recorded, so you will soon be able to watch it again. I would like to thank all the interpreters which have been making an excellent work. Thank you for the support, and also thank you to all of you for your participation. And thank you to Émilie Gaillard from the Chaire pour la Normandie for Peace. And see you soon. Have a great evening, great rest of the day. So I'm so happy because we had so many beautiful words as peace and harmony together today. So it was really nice. Thank you so much.